So I'm thrilled to be a part of that legacy. Nick has also been a researcher into the history of Civil War veterans who came to California after the war and co-curated a museum exhibit on that at the Pasadena Museum of History. He has given talks at roundtables and historic gatherings over the years on a variety of topics, most recently on Civil War prisons. Nick's talks always receive great praise for combining excellent oratorical skills with fascinating insights into history. And tonight you're going to hear one of those. Nick, take it away.
All right. Now, one of the things I do not do is PowerPoint presentations. So you're going to be stuck just with my face and voice for this because I'm going to tell you a story. And it's the story of a place in Kentucky. Now, you may not have thought of Kentucky as being part of the raising of African American troops during the Civil War, but in fact, the second largest number of African American troops raised during the Civil War were those raised in Kentucky. And the reason was an odd one. It was because Kentucky didn't really want them. You see, for the first half of the war, since Kentucky was still both a Union state and a slaveholding state, they had very mixed feelings about things involving African Americans. And even after the Union changed their rules and the laws to permit African American troops to be raised, Kentucky wanted no part of that and did not offer to raise any regiments for the Union of African Americans. However, once it was pointed out to the governor of Kentucky that African American troops raised within the state would count toward Kentucky's quota of troops as far as the numbers that they had to provide by volunteers or by the draft, suddenly the state of Kentucky changed their policy on this and said, oh, all right, you can start enlisting free African Americans in the state of Kentucky. Well, that's nice, but there weren't very many of those. Most free African Americans in Kentucky had left Kentucky at the start of the war or before that because they didn't feel very welcome. In the 1850s, there had been an attempt to form a college at Berea that would include having African American students as well as, shockingly enough, women permitted to learn things. And that college was basically chased out of the state along with its founder, John Fee, who was an anti-slavery activist as well as a preacher and well, he had several roles in the founding of Berea. But he and the college were basically chased out of the state in 1859. Well, the census of 1860 showed that the bulk of the African American population of military age were still enslaved. So an interesting compromise was reached. The federal government offered to buy them at a discount and free them and have them be as soldiers. So any slaveholder in the state of Kentucky who could provide a male slave of military age would be given $300 for permission for the army to enlist that man and free him. There were some of the slaveholders who agreed to that, but the problem that came up immediately was, what do you do about the men who are held as slaves by farm holders who have gone off to serve the Confederates?
Mic off.
You can't find them to pay them the money. And in addition, some of them had already run away. In fact, one of them was awarded the Medal of Honor later after having run away from one of the farms in Kentucky. So the rules were loosened, and men who had left slavery on their own, whether or not their slaveholder was a Confederate, were also enlisted. Now, then there was the question of where do you train them? And by the rules at that time, typically you trained them somewhere near where they enlisted. There was land available in eastern Kentucky and Camp Nelson was built there. Camp Nelson was large to start and became gigantic. It was actually one of the largest training camps in the country, much less for African American troops. There were several regiments raised there and others that were simply stationed there or trained there, so that during the course of 1864 and 65, over 10,000 African American troops passed through Camp Douglas. There were things that the Army had not considered, though. When they raised the other African American units, the free African Americans in those, the ones who were the most literate, the most educated, quickly became the corporals and sergeants. If you were trying to raise a regiment that is basically entirely consisting of ex-slaves as the enlisted men, remember, it was still illegal in many areas to teach your slaves to read, and so almost none of them were fully literate. A few of them could read a little bit, a few of them could write their names. But for the corporals and sergeants of a regiment, they need to be able to do more than that. So it was quickly decided that maybe some kind of school would be needed. Well, that's where John Fee came in, because he was right over the border in Ohio, and he had heard that this camp was being built, and he thought that it would be a great idea to be involved with it. So he came back to Kentucky and he saw, there needs to be a school. And so he helped create a school. He sort of strong-armed one of the religious groups that was nominally anti-slavery into helping provide funding for this school, because the Army couldn't figure out how to cover that in their books. They needed to teach these men, but they didn't really have a system for educating them. In fact, they barely had a system for educating officers. Other than West Point, there were no plans in place at the start of the war for educating officers, and when it became necessary to teach enlisted men how to become officers, to provide officers for the United States colored troops and the similar regiments, a school was set up in Philadelphia to educate officers. That didn't help in educating the enlisted men, however. So the school was set up. Then the other practical issues began to arise, and one of them had to do with the institution of slavery itself. In Kentucky, like in most of the southern states, in theory, slaves were kept as family units. In practice, these were not enforced as family units. They were not stable family units. And in fact, many of them were not even recognized by anybody other than the owners of the slaves in question. So, what happens if the male part of a family is freed by the U.S. Army, and you're the slaveholder, and they've given you $300, and the woman of that slave and the children are still there on your farm, not paying for their keep in terms of the work that they can do? Depending on the age of the children, that wasn't necessarily possible, but one of the effects was that some of the farmers in Kentucky decided, well, this is the Army's fault, so they can take care of them, and they kicked out the women and children from their own farms. Those women and children very reasonably went to Camp Nelson. The Army had no plans to provide for these, and this created yet another layer of problems, because the first men to arrive and try to enlist were turned away because the rules weren't set yet. So 250 African Americans initially were turned away and had to come back and reapply for the Army. The women, though, were basically refugees, and the Army didn't like the idea of running a refugee camp in a Union state. This wasn't like in South Carolina, where they had invaded South Carolina and set up a facility for slaves to escape to and then be taken care of. No, this was a Union state where slavery was still legal, and they didn't know what to do about the fact that these were not runaways. they were being kicked out by their supposed owners. So this created another level of problems that the Army didn't want to deal with. All through 18...
Mic on.
We lost the audio.
There, it's back. There was a technical problem that somewhere down the line I got a warning that my sound had gone dead. Anyway, so all through 1864, this got worse because the number of people at Camp Nelson kept getting bigger. Initially, there were a few refugees, a few women and children, but as the numbers of troops raised there got larger, the number of refugees got larger. Usually in the hundreds, sometimes in the thousands. And that became a problem for the Army. One of the problems was the structure for who administers a camp like that. A camp like that, like Camp Nelson, had several layers of administration covering it. And unfortunately for the circumstances, one of the officers whose job it was to administer that camp and similar facilities in Kentucky was a brigadier general named Speed Fry. Now, let me explain something to you about Speed Fry. He actually had military combat commands at a couple of points during the war. He served all the way through to the end of the war, and at the end of the war, almost every other brigadier general with his time in service was given sort of an honorary promotion, a brevet promotion to major general. This didn't have any effect on retirement pay or anything. It was purely ceremonial. It was purely a thank you. The Army didn't do that with Speed Fry. Even though he and his unit were given credit for killing a Confederate general, he tried to take personal responsibility for doing it. And the problem was that there was very little reason they couldn't have just taken him prisoner. He was there by mistake. He thought he was approaching a Confederate unit, and so General Zelikofer of the Confederate Army basically walked up to Speed Fry's unit and started giving them orders, and they said, "What?" And Zelikofer's own aide rode forward trying to get the general's attention and fired a shot in the air trying to get him to turn around. Well, Speed Fry and some of his men then pointed their guns at General Zelikofer and shot him. So that had sort of mixed reviews in military circles, and Speed Fry was eventually given a non-combat position of administering much of Kentucky as far as facilities like Camp Nelson. His supervisor was the other General Thomas, not the Rock of Chickamauga, but no, the other one, who was a paper pusher and an older gentleman, an adjutant general who was in his 60s and sat around his office trying to keep track of things in an area where he wasn't particularly liked because he kept trying to get the people in Kentucky to follow the rules that the War Department wanted. Speed Fry committed one of the most hideous acts in military history by thinking he was following the rules. In November of 1864, he decided that the Army should not be taking care of these women and children, even related to troops either stationed at Camp Nelson or that had been sent into the field from Camp Nelson. So at the end of November of 1864, he kicked them all out. If any of you have ever been in Kentucky in the winter, you'll know that it's not a warm place. Over 120 of those women and children died before they could be rescued by people who thought wait a minute, what is he doing? Speed Fry was censured for it, but not removed from command. But as I said, he didn't get his end of the war promotion a few months later, the way others did. John Fee was one of the people who had been fighting to organize the refugee camps and to keep them educated, fed, clothed, and housed. And he happened to be away from the camp in that November. The other problem that the troops there faced, Camp Nelson, because it was so large, was actually designed to train different troops for different things. Rather than being just a facility for, say, training infantry, Camp Nelson turned out multiple regiments of infantry, at least 2 regiments of cavalry, and 1 regiment of artillery. The artillerymen were trained so that they could be garrisons in various forts in the Tennessee and Kentucky area in order to free up other troops for mobility. The cavalry, however, met one of the same fates that other troops had in earlier times, because you see, the officers commanding United States colored troops were frequently political appointees, and only the captains and lieutenants knew what they were doing. In this case, one of the cavalry regiments that was still being organized at Camp Nelson was thrown into combat. What happened was that from eastern Kentucky, a raid was being planned to Saltville in Virginia. Now, Saltville, like its name implies, was the source of salt. If you've never eaten Civil War food, you may not have thought about the fact that a lot of it has a lot of salt in it as a preservative. Ham, bacon, salt pork. You can't make most of those in the methods that they did without salt. So salt was important not only to the Army, but to the civilian population, and there were heavy salt works in Saltville. So the commander of the troops in eastern Kentucky thought, let's grab everyone we can and go storming into Saltville. Now, the 5th Regiment of United States Colored Cavalry was still being organized. They didn't have their weapons yet. They didn't have their horses yet. They didn't have a roster of their regiment yet. And they were told, that's okay, you're going anyway. They were given untrained horses, Enfield rifles, not carbines, Enfield rifles, and told, you're coming with us. There shouldn't be much fighting, so just be prepared in case you have to. And this expedition sent off to Saltville. When they arrived at Saltville late in the day, there was very little defense of Saltville. There were a few local militiamen there in Saltville who were running around panicking because there was a large Union force approaching. Well, the commander of this expedition did what many commanders have done in such situations. He found a way to be stupid. In this case, he decided, it's late in the day, there's not much defense there, we'll wait until morning to attack. All night, Confederate troops from all around that section of Tennessee raced into Saltville, and by the next morning, they had enough there to put up a fight. That in itself wouldn't have been the big problem that it could have been had the commander of the Union forces actually prepared for a fight. He assumed there wouldn't be much fighting, and so he didn't really plan very well. So the 5th Regiment of United States Colored Cavalry, standing there next to their horses because they could barely ride them, and they certainly couldn't fight on horseback with Enfield rifles, were told, okay, you go advance against the Confederates there. on foot. That might work. And they were sent in along with some of the other Union forces. Had they attacked the previous night, they probably would have captured Saltville and been able to destroy the salt works. But now the defenders were there in such numbers that there was an actual battle involved. And the problem with that was, because their commander hadn't prepared for an actual battle, he hadn't brought all that much ammunition. And so, as the fighting wore on, the troops, including the 5th Colored Cavalry, started running out of ammunition. Now, this is about the most stupid thing you can do if you're going to attack anywhere, is forget to bring the ammunition. But that's basically what he did. He hadn't planned this. So they had to withdraw, not because they were losing the battle, but because they were running out of ammunition. And as they started to withdraw back to the main Union positions, the Confederates, who had been outraged by the fact that there were dark-skinned soldiers coming at them that day, decided to countercharge and see what would happen. The regimental commander of the 5th U.S. Colored Cavalry and the general commanding the overall attack panicked and ran away, taking what troops they could with them. This did not include the wounded who couldn't run on their own. This did not include the people who couldn't escape quickly from the battle. So it was that a number of the troops from the 5th U.S. Colored Cavalry were taken prisoner, especially ones that were seriously wounded. They were taken to a hospital there on the battlefield. Over the course of the next day, witnesses attest that Confederate guerrilla Champ Ferguson went into the hospital and simply shot 7 of them, as well as one of the white officers who was wounded and in the hospital. Gunshots were reported from all over the battlefield after the battle ended. The numbers of casualties from that fight are unclear because they didn't have a regimental roster to work from. They could only count from people's memories of who might be missing. Probably about 50 of the men from the U.S. Colored Cavalry were murdered there at that battlefield or in the hospital. Champ Ferguson was actually charged with a war crime a few months later after the end of the war, and was one of the few people executed for that, other than the fellow from Andersonville, because witnesses, including white doctors and witnesses, were willing to testify against him because hospital staff had to struggle against him to keep him from murdering more prisoners who were wounded. Of the ones who escaped, the Union troops back at their camp were horrified to discover how badly wounded some of them were, but they said, "We don't dare stay behind," because of what they were doing. Well, you would think that the Army would learn its lesson, but in fact, that cavalry regiment didn't get new weapons. They didn't get carbines. And so it was that on a later expedition, where they were part of the escort for a bunch of supplies, they were attacked again. And one of the problems is that Enfields are not the best weapon to be holding if you're traveling and it's raining. So they were attacked as the rear guard of a supply run, and they were basically cut off because they had no usable gunpowder in their weapons. And again, a number of them were massacred after being caught by Confederate guerrillas. Now, it wasn't all horror stories. The 10,000 soldiers who passed through Camp Nelson actually put in a lot of good work over the time of the war. 1864 and into 1865 Some of them were not released from service until the end of 1865 or into 1866. That was one of the things that went on with the United States colored cavalry and infantry and artillery units. Their release from service was sort of haphazard. But what about the camp itself? Well, remember, it was being used as a refugee camp, a military training camp, and a school, as well as in some cases a medical facility. So what's the plan for this at the end of the war? Kentucky had never seceded. The people in Kentucky wanted things to go back to as normal as possible, but slavery was ending. Lincoln had warned the people in Kentucky that this war would probably bring about the end of slavery in their state as well as elsewhere, but folks in Kentucky just hadn't taken that too seriously. It wasn't until March of 1865, though, that the federal government officially freed the families of the soldiers that were trained at Camp Nelson. That in itself was astonishing, but also probably the right thing to do, because these were men who had risked their lives and their families were legally still slaves, even though they had been freed. So, March of 1865, their families are free. April of 1865, the war kind of starts ending, although for some of those men, as I said, it didn't end for another year. What happens about the local community? Camp Nelson was the perfect place to build a new community in eastern Kentucky, one where African Americans could have their own piece of land. That isn't what happened for the most part. There was a small town founded where the buildings had been removed from Camp Nelson. You see, the federal government decided any of the buildings that were part of the military camp don't need to stay there. So all that was left were the Sanitary Commission buildings, one of the official buildings, I believe, that was used for hospital purposes other than the Sanitary Commission, and a few of the houses that were used by the refugees. Most of those were torn down too. So a town was built there at Camp Nelson. Officially, that town was called Hall, Kentucky. Apparently, nobody called it that. For 30 years after the war, people still referred to that little community as Camp Nelson. It was remembered by the people in Kentucky. There was a school built there, and after the war, John Fee went back and reopened his school at Berea, which was about 30 miles away. He wanted to have a school like Oberlin in Ohio, but in Kentucky, one where white and black students, male and female students, could all be on one campus. And this time he wasn't chased out, not right away. You see, the culture of Kentucky still wasn't too thrilled with the idea of educating poor students or black students or female students. Over the course of the next 30 years, slowly the rules were changed to make it less and less integrated. In 1866, when it was opened, it was basically half black and half white. By 1901, it was basically an all-white school. Even though in 1897, students from that community, from the community of Hall becoming Camp Nelson, were still enrolling in Berea, 30 miles away, and some of them were even temporarily famous. You see, the students from the Camp Nelson school, the school that John Fee had founded there, which was to educate up through about high school level, had some wonderfully talented singers. And they had sung at a Salvation Army Memorial Day event And they had entertained people so thoroughly that they were sent to perform for President McKinley. And he enjoyed their music as well. They retired from singing when they enrolled in Berea College. And then they were eventually told, oh, by the way, you don't really fit here because we're making it an all-white college. Camp Nelson itself, the men who died there and the bodies that they were able to retrieve are buried in a small national cemetery at Camp Nelson. It's about 3 acres. It's beautifully laid out. The overall camp itself was gigantic. The current park that's there surrounding the cemetery is about 500 acres, and that's only a fraction of the land that was occupied by the military encampment, the refugee camps, the schools, the hospitals, and what have you. Only, I believe, 2 of the original buildings are still standing, unfortunately. The Sanitary Commission building was gigantic, and that one just didn't survive because it was a wooden building built in 1864. The other buildings that were there were torn down mainly by the Army. And the few that survived, the houses, a house built for refugees in 1864 really isn't designed to last 160 years, so those are gone. But the place itself and the place that it holds in history is, I think, a unique one because the troops there suffered 2 massacres in the field. But the really horrific one was the massacre of their families caused by a Union general who just made terrible decisions. And so even though hundreds of them died at the hands of Confederates and guerrillas, the 120 of them who died at the hands of the Union command structure were the real tragedy there. It wasn't like at Fort Pillow where people died because of bad command and confusing situations. No, the Saltville massacre was just that, a massacre. You don't kill people in a hospital by accident or because they haven't quite surrendered. There, though, the Saltville case, it was just so badly bungled by the Union Army. If they'd been given enough ammunition to keep fighting, that massacre would never have happened. And that makes it more horrific because they were sent into battle with untrained horses, the wrong weapons, and insufficient ammunition to actually do their jobs. And then abandoned there as their commanding general basically ran for his life, not for the lives of his men. So Camp Nelson, what else can it teach us about the history of those men and the women who were there? An important lesson was learned by the African Americans of Kentucky. And they actually stated that. One of them was quoted as saying, you know, before the war, we had to go hundreds of miles to Canada to be free. Now, from Lexington, it was only 18 miles to Camp Nelson. 18 miles to our new Canada. The symbol of Camp Nelson and the idea that men and women and children all went to the same place, not only for safety, but to do their part for the safety of others. That made a difference. Even in the case of a man like Speed Fry, who didn't necessarily know what to do and didn't do a good job of managing. But it made a difference to 10,000 men and to the families of those 10,000 men and to anyone who heard the stories from those 10,000 men and their families. The regiments, 5 regiments of infantry 2 regiments of cavalry and 1 of artillery that were officially the output of Camp Nelson are only part of the story as a result. The freedom that resulted from their travels there and the rules that were changed as part of what the Army learned from trying to run such a facility, that made a difference too. The organization known as the Freedmen's Bureau was responsible for tearing down Camp Nelson after the war. That's one of those little known bits of their job. They were actually, there's a longer name, but it includes the Abandoned Property Freedmen and something Bureau. Freedmen's Bureau was the short form of it. But they were responsible for tearing things down that were no longer needed by the Army after the end of the war. Even things that could have been used by the newly freed people who had been held as slaves. And that's really part of the tragedy. Camp Nelson was the good site for a community of African Americans in eastern Kentucky. Partly for political reasons, it couldn't be permitted. And so most of it was torn down, and the little community of Hall, whose name wasn't even used, was all that was left. The little college of Berea, the educational mecca that was potentially the African American educational hub for Kentucky, gradually became another segregated white school. And so even the memory of that was lost over the years. Saltville, most people don't remember that the way they do Fort Pillow. It wasn't as prominent. And frankly, the reasons for the massacre were so embarrassing because there shouldn't have been one. Having a massacre because your commanding officer doesn't plan for enough ammunition for you to complete a fight. The Union Army didn't want to talk about that. And so it was always remember Fort Pillow, not remember Saltville. They definitely didn't want to talk about the deaths of the women and children. So there was no Remember Camp Nelson commemoration held honoring the deaths of those women and children at the end of November. It's too close to Thanksgiving anyway, and people didn't want to be depressed and get away from their turkeys. But Camp Nelson made a difference. Camp Nelson showed that a facility like that could be built, could be operated, and could do things to help win the war. If it had come up again, the Army, the War Department, would have learned enough lessons to make that something valuable. But by the time of the Spanish-American War, places had started being segregated again. And the African-American troops that served in Cuba were not trained in a place like Camp Nelson and were not even given credit for the things that they actually did, like taking San Juan Hill. So, was Camp Nelson a success or a failure? It was both. It was the potential for a turning point in history. It was the potential for a place to remember and to celebrate. But weirdly enough, it wasn't even fully protected as a national site until just a few years ago. And so much of its history was lost. In fact, it was Donald Trump who signed the Protective Act to protect what little was left that far after the fact. Was Camp Nelson something worth remembering? I think it needs to be remembered, both for its successes and its failures, because without both of them, you're not getting the whole story. Without the deaths of the men from the 5th U.S. Colored Cavalry, you don't know why things can go wrong or how they can go wrong. The men from the infantry and the artillery units trained there actually had a very good reputation. They were good garrison troops used in Kentucky and Tennessee. And the infantry didn't have the same problems. They were never sent into impossible situations without ammunition. So there were successes there. But just as someone who's a student of history, I do wish Speed Fry had been given another post instead, because there was no excuse for the deaths of those families. And to be honest, I'm glad he didn't receive his post-war promotion. And I can't say that for most people. Because this was a man so hidebound and so insistent on following rules that didn't apply that those lives were on his hands. And that's the real tragedy of what went wrong at Camp Nelson. So, oh, I just saw a question. I was about to open the floor for questions, but Janet just asked the question on the chat, were there other colored cavalry units? Yes, there were several of them. Most of the United States colored troops were raised as infantry because they were going to be used for garrison troops. But there were at least a half a dozen fully formed cavalry regiments raised at different locations. And there were a couple of other regiments raised by states that were absorbed into it. The regiment raised by Massachusetts kept its Massachusetts appellation, but the 5th and 6th of the cavalry regiments were raised at Camp Nelson as part of the troops there. The idea was that the colored cavalry would be raiding and patrolling railroad lines. And in theory, they'd be able to move more quickly than infantry. If you give them trained horses and if you give them carbines, that actually works. The 5th was basically given untrained horses and rifles, so they were sort of dragoons, but without the real training of dragoons. So they were sent places to stand and fight. That only works for so long. The fact that they were not re-equipped with carbines was just ridiculous. It made it very difficult for them to do their actual job of patrolling or raiding. And let's see.
There's another question from Janet, a couple
Yes.
above that.
Yes, I saw. On what basis was the government able to free the enslaved families of the soldiers in March 1865? Basically, Congress passed a law that nobody figured out was challengeable because it's like, wait, what does that say? And what it did was retroactively grant freedom to the families of the men who were freed by a previous law that had been put into place, granting freedom to enslaved men who were bought by the army to be soldiers. And the whole thing was kind of screwy because a lot of former slaves were actually already in the U.S. colored troops and in things like the 54th and 55th Massachusetts. And when they were told they had to swear that they were not slaves, they used the Quaker workaround, basically saying that I owe no man my servitude. So there were some things there. The Emancipation Proclamation did not apply in Kentucky, except there was public opinion that it should have applied to people who were being held as slaves by men who were serving in Confederate forces. Identifying those was the hard part, and that was not really coherently done. It wasn't just the Orphan Brigade and all of that. No, they were joining regiments in Tennessee. So that the whole Orphan Brigade thing was kind of just a confusion. There were a lot of Kentuckians who served in Confederate forces. And so the difficulty was identifying those and making a legal point that they had forfeited their property because they had joined the Confederacy was something that the Army didn't really want to deal with, and the U.S. Attorney General didn't want to deal with. So passing a questionable law was actually the simpler solution. And let's see. There was a question Roy Atherton asked, this event, are there any recent or past publications regarding the events of this camp? There are, but mostly they're local publications that were done in Kentucky. Weirdly enough, one of the publications that I got to research this talk was published for the State Fair in Kentucky by one of their historical groups. There are a couple of books that go into the history, but most of them study it from the viewpoint of John Fee, because he's the guy who was actually well known because of Berea College. The administrators of the camp, like Speed Fry, well, nobody really wanted to do good histories of them because, you know, even though he was a military officer, even though he was a commander in the field, even other than shooting General Zelikofer of the Confederates, he had the interesting habit of showing up with his troops at the end of battles. And whether that was due to any actual reticence on his part to show up and fight was not clear, but he tended to move slowly in the direction of fighting when he was told to go toward fighting. And so at Stones River and Shiloh and things like that, his troops just happened to get there just as things were calming down and there was no more fighting to be done. So there's not a lot of good stuff to say about him as a field commander, and he was the other person to write about it. The story of the casualties at Saltville, there are a couple of things written about Saltville. There are a couple of things written about the other fights that the 5th U.S. Colored Cavalry were in, but not so much about the other regiments, because for the most part, the artillery and infantry units there were garrison troops that didn't really fight very much. So there are very minor histories of them available. The National Park Service has a couple of paragraphs on each one, but that's about it. So other than that, there's not a lot written about the troops that were raised there. There is another question. Has any mail to or from Camp Nelson survived? Not much, and the reason is, remember, these men, unlike the ones in other colored regiments, had to be taught to read and write for practical purposes. They had no practical history of writing letters to people. The men in the 54th and 55th Massachusetts would write letters to their families or to newspapers all the time, but that was something from their personal family traditions. These were men who had to be taught to read and write in order to follow instructions and orders. There was really very little education in the fine arts of writing nice letters to your family, because if your family didn't read either and hadn't been allowed to learn to read, there wasn't a lot of point to it. And the newspapers in Kentucky were not, how shall I put this, encouraging African Americans to write letters to their editors to publish in their papers. And so only the national African American newspapers and a couple of the abolitionist papers would have printed anything they wrote. So there's very little in writing by the members of those units. Somebody mentioned the 8th U.S. Colored Heavy Artillery at Paducah, and yes, that unit was actually raised at a different camp. They were the ones who fought at Fort Pillow and who had the casualties there. Remember, Fort Pillow, though, was earlier in 1864, before most of the regiments at Camp Nelson were in the field. The fall of 1864 was when those regiments saw action. And someone, Rich Jankowski mentioned that the Amy Morrell Taylor book, Embattled Freedom, tells of Camp Nelson as a refugee camp. There are several places that tell a little bit. I have not read Embattled Freedom yet. I'll have to track that down and see what it includes as far as the information. Because what I'm looking for at this point are sources for numbers, because no two sources that I've found so far list the same numbers for the refugee camp as far as its size. And that's really unusual because they had to feed them. And so there were numbers that the Army had just based on costs, except they were partly being fed by the Sanitary Commission and partly being fed by the abolitionist group that John Fee was involved with. And so there may not be a single source with accurate numbers. But it would be interesting to see if that book has some.
Nick, I have written in, are there any current members who have done genealogy on their families that would be traceable back to the camp?
Well,
I don't know how you find that out, because I think that's would be a very rich history to be added to what hasn't really been written about or is knowledgeable to a lot of people.
I will tell you that based on my own experiences trying to research things in Kentucky, genealogical sources, good luck with that. The state of Kentucky did not make any effort to organize the material that was kept in town halls and churches and other places all over the state. And bear in mind that the air quotes weddings that were held in the slave communities were not necessarily documented. So it's not until the generation after the war that you start having birth certificates or wedding certificates put anywhere. And one of the difficulties is that since they were never gathered, they were scattered around the state, maybe thrown away when somebody didn't see the reason to keep them anymore, maybe put with other records but never indexed. And so my own family on my great-grandmother's side was in Kentucky, not too far away from Camp Nelson. One thing that she did basically cut off genealogical research of that branch of the family because she got upset with my great-grandfather and erased his name from the family Bible. So we don't have his first name. And that kind of thing is common, and there's no way to connect from her name to the records that anybody has found. One of my distant cousins was attempting to do research from much closer and ran into the same wall that without his name there was nothing to connect because the few things that were filed under the husband or father's name. And so there are people who have traced their ancestry to those units. Some of them are in the Sons of Union Veterans of the Civil War, but not as many as there might be simply because it's so bleeping hard to get the records out of Kentucky.
Well, all I can say is that's a damn shame.
Well, if the Camp Nelson stuff had been maintained as a community, more would have been preserved. But because most of the people were chased out, well, what happens? They're scattered all over.
Yeah, who knows where they went?
Right. And
would they have stayed in Kentucky or moved out into Tennessee or up in Ohio?
That's the whole thing. They were scattered. The ones that I have traced, some of them show up in later census data in Kentucky, but there was no particularly compelling reason to stay near Camp Nelson without a town being built there.
Yeah.
So they moved either to farming communities or to the cities of Kentucky or out of the area.
Well, excellent program you put on tonight about something that I'm sure most of us were not even aware of.
Well, Janet asked me to come up with something that was not well known, but that related to the African American troops. And I figured, you know, I don't think people know this story.
That's right. I think it's important you continue with it.
Well, we'll see. I keep getting distracted by other projects.
Excellent work, though. Very good. Very good presentation. Thank you.
And if any of you have other questions, you can put them in chat, and because that's where I've been getting the ones I've been reading back to you. But if not, thank you for having me as your speaker tonight.
Thank you, Nick, for being with us. You certainly met the challenge of finding a little-known story of African American Civil War history.
Thank you, Nick.
And by the way, a couple of the buildings that were there at the site were photographed, and unfortunately the University of Kentucky has, I think they said 16 photographs that were taken on the grounds there during the Civil War, and that's it.
16?
Yes. There were just a handful of surviving photographs taken at Camp Nelson. And University of Kentucky says if you give them 5 days warning and reserve a research room, they can show you what they've got, but they only have the 16 photos.
Well, can they make copies of them?
I haven't managed to talk them into that. I don't know what the condition is, but it's in a reference storage thing, and the 5 days warning suggests that it's really deeply buried in their reference storage.
Where they hope nobody finds them, I guess.
Well, where they hope nobody asks for them.
Yeah.
Because it's really like that deeply buried.
Wow. Amazing. All righty.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
Next month when I go back to my ceremonial post of just introducing the meeting.
Well done. Well done.
Thank you, Nick.
All right. Good night, everyone.
Night.
Good night.